Hello and welcome back to my channel. I am Bob, the Bookerer, and I don't know why I forgot my own name or channel name there for a second. In sort of part one, I spoke about the first shortlist from this year's Polari Prize. So that's the first book prize. And in this, I'm going to be talking about the second shortlist, which is non-debuts. And it's a really fun list again. I think I sort of said this in the first one, but I think what's really exciting about this prize is that there is a mix of fiction, non-fiction, poetry, plays, whatever, anything that kind of falls under sort of literature. And, I think what is really exciting is as a result, authors and books that previously wouldn't get that much attention if it was maybe just a fiction prize or just the poetry prize kind of get this sort of exposure in a way that I think is really interesting. So let's get started. The winner for this year's Polari Prize, the non-debut one, was Diana Souhami with No Modernism Without Lesbians, which is firstly just like the best title. I really enjoyed that. But this is such a gorgeous book. So this is a non-fiction book that looks at the lives of particularly 4 women, but many other characters in the meantime, and the various roles that they played in developing thoughts and supporting authors who would lead thoughts in terms of modernism. And so we get a few kind of characters sort of cycle in and out. We get, for example, people that you might expect, so people like Virginia Woolf and Vita Sackville West. James Joyce features fairly prominently in some parts. But these 4 women, with the exception perhaps of Gertrude Stein, are less well known, and I really enjoyed actually hearing their perspectives and kind of hearing a bit about their lives. And I think what is so brilliant about this book and really kind of clever is I am sometimes worried about I sometimes find it difficult to engage with books that are sort of biography in some ways, particularly if I'm not necessarily that clued into much of the context or much of the area, because I can sometimes find it, it can be somewhat alienating, right? Particularly if you don't really know enough about it to really have a strong opinion. And I think what I found really quite impressive about this book is it's actually fairly light and breezy, which is not to take away from the kind of the seriousness and the kind of the excellence of the academia going on, but it's actually really easy to read, given that it's about 4 characters in history who you might not necessarily know much about. And I don't think you have to go into this with a great amount of wider context. If anything, she sets up the context really nicely. And I think what's really interesting is sort of seeing, I think she sort of says a little bit in the prologue to this book, that there is there's always a risk in terms of imposing sort of modern day labels or identities onto these characters and to these real life people. But the kind of term lesbian roughly covers that. And there is sort of a bit more, there's a kind of fluidity in terms of sexuality and gender presentation and gender identity within these figures. But still, I thought was so interesting. And there's this really interesting scene kind of early on where we learn about the woman, Sylvia Beach, who was behind getting Ulysses by James Joyce published, and the absolute backlash that she faced. The book was banned multiple times. She was even having to, James Joyce was still correcting proofs and making edits like 2 days before the publication date, and she worked apparently through the night to get everything together to get this book out. And as much as part of me was like, oh, and then I had to study at uni. Thanks, Sylvia. Part of me, it's impressive. That book was such a game changer. Whether you like it or not as a book, that book did a lot in terms of propelling forward a certain type of literature. And it's weird now to imagine a world in which James Joyce's Ulysses might not exist because because it hadn't been championed at the right time. And James Joyce particularly was, I think, somewhat early into his career and could have sort of also gone into somewhat, not obscurity, but not been as received, because Ulysses was able to be published. It also meant that he was then able to publish things like Finnegan's Wake and other books. And so there's, having those little moments sort of changes a lot of things. And these other, I think it's just kind of really interesting to read about these women who, in some cases were, really struggling to make ends meet, and in some cases were basically the equivalent of modern day billionaires or multimillionaires, and that was the only way that many of them could explore their identities. You know, the only way that they could be free enough to explore their sexuality and their gender and who they were was because in many cases they were wealthy enough to not care what anybody thought. You know, they could go and live somewhere, they could set up a lesbian commune, they could do whatever they want, which is kind of the dream, right? But I found that really, really interesting. I think Diana Souhami herself has done an incredible job in putting this book together. It's a real achievement, I think, of a book. And it was also really fun at the prize ceremony when she won, because she was sort of quite blasé about it, and, you know, quite a chilled way of sort of like, do I need to win any prizes? You know, like, I'm fine, I'm old. You know, these are her words, I'm not saying this about her. She said that she was going to spend the prize money on a trip to Lanzarote, which I loved her. Like, I think everyone in the room was just so absolutely charmed by her that we were like, even, like, obviously this is not a personality contest, it's a book prize, but I think if it had been a personality contest, she'd have won as well. Everyone just loved her. So this is a really beautiful book, and I think I did really enjoy it. I got a lot from it. I mean, I will say, you know, some parts maybe were less personally interesting to me, but I still think overall just a real achievement of a book, and I think a lot of people would get a lot from this. Next up in this is Dragman by Stephen Appleby, and this is a graphic novel, and I think this prize particularly is probably the most varied in terms of the kinds of books that make up the finalists and the shortlist. It's really interesting. I was so absolutely charmed by this book. I've spoken about Dragman separately, I think, in another video before, but essentially it is a graphic novel kind of in a sort of superhero sort of theme of this character who, when they put on articles of women's clothing, gain superpowers, and particularly the ability to fly. And this is sort of a, you know, a really sweet and adorable kind of metaphor or kind of image, I guess, for, you know, the kind of power that comes with being able to be your authentic self, and the power that comes from sort of being able to dress up and be creative. And so this book follows this really interesting and really quite touching story of this character. And, you know, there's sort of a bit of a discussion at one point about whether they are trans, whether they are just sort of just wearing women's clothes, where that identity falls. I'm going to use they for the sort of easiest sort of use of that, but I think throughout the book it's fairly interchangeable. And it kind of just goes into that really lovely comic book kind of story of, you know, battling the bad guys who are trying to take over the world and do all of these things, and these other people have superpowers. And I just thought it was really sweet and touching, just as a very charming book to have this character. And Stephen Appleby was at the award ceremony and gave a reading from a book that was kind of coming up in some other parts. And I thought it was really interesting what he was saying there about his identity, and, you know, he lives quite a lot of his life wearing sort of women's clothing, or, you know, or whatever, and he sort of says that he sort of feels a kind of superpower from that, and that sort of was part of the inspiration for this book. And I just thought it was really beautifully done. It's very funny, it's very charming and warming, and I wasn't expecting to really like it as much as I did. I kind of thought it was going to be a bit cliched, and it kind of does follow some of those sort of comic book tropes, but I think is sort of just fun, so I kind of didn't mind. I don't care if it feels like the same story I've heard multiple times. That it was such a charming way of approaching it that I gave into it and just enjoyed it. And I just think it's just such a brilliant book, and I just thought it was really fun. So yeah, great to see a graphic novel on this list alongside everything else that we've got here. Next up, we have Caroline Bird with The Air Year, and this is one of two collections of poetry that is on this shortlist. And I was really, again, quite charmed by this. It's a collection of poems that is sort of dealing with sexuality and gender and identity, but also kind of looking at it through the lens of things around breakups. And there's a real urgency and a real beauty to a lot of these poems that I thought was really quite charming and really clever, because it quite a lot of the time it feels like it could have dipped into cliche, but it just steers clear for me. And I thought there's a real sort of sense of loss in some of these poems that was really physical, And, you know, this is, you know, please don't drink every time I say the word physical when I'm talking about poetry, because you will be very drunk. And because, but that's the thing I love most about really good poetry is where, pardon me, it feels like the words do something, because there's a sparseness and you know, there's a real consideration to every word that gives this kind of weight and power to them, and that feels very physical to me. And there was a lot in this collection that felt like that, and I was really just excited to see how this went. And again, just, you know, in terms of comparing apples and oranges, the idea of this against No Modernism without Lesbians, or against Dragman, is just such a wild ride of a kind of comparison. But I thought this book did that really cleverly and was just really interesting overall. And I'd recommend, if you can sort of find a copy. I think a lot of, I got my copy through Libby, and I think lots of other apps will potentially have a copy of it. I just thought it was a really interesting book to check out. Next up was The Intoxicating Mr Lavelle by Neil Blackmore. And I've spoken about this in another video. I really enjoyed this. I, again, was not expecting to. No, I mean, it wasn't like I was going into it thinking I was going to hate it. It wasn't that at all. I just sometimes struggle a little bit with books that are sort of set in historical periods. And I was worried that it would fall down a rabbit hole. Maybe that feels like a really cynical take of mine, to think that that was going to be the case with the book before I read it. But anyway, it concerns these two men, and this kind of foppish identity, this kind of really, those kind of really Wildian kind of characters are these sort of very larger than life, extravagant men. And I, again, think this book does something really clever in terms of taking that very sort of, what at first seems like quite a frivolous and like flippant kind of identity, where you might suspect that there's not much beneath the surface, you know, these kind of grand dames of the theatre kind of characters. And it really imbues it with a sense of real tragedy, because these sort of men will go out and have these sort of really extravagant looks, but that is almost entirely a shield, in the same way that, you know, many drag queens talk about their drag being a kind of shield, of kind of really reclaiming an identity that's been taken from them, and really allowing themselves to be bigger and bolder than they ever dreamed. And so what's really clever is these two men sort of basically have this relationship, and there's this sort of love between these two men, and everyone is sort of warning either side of them, like, don't get involved, like, this is a terrible idea, you know, this is very much a time where you could be very strong, you know, arrested and often beaten for even just being seen to be somewhat different. And this, the sort of, as the story goes on, we get this real, again, queer yearning that I think is so beautifully captured in this book, of observing what it looks like to have this sort of object of affection and be so excited about it, but not be able to tell a soul. And even then, to be really cautious when you're with that person, because you think at any moment this could be taken away from you, or even they could report you, or, you know, anything else could happen. And so I thought this book was really clever in how it approached that, and then how later it unravels a bit more of the story behind some of these men, and the real tragedy and pain that they've often gone through. And also there's this sort of callousness to one of the men, that I thought was handled really cleverly, because it would be very easy to treat that kind of character again as a sort of boogeyman, like, oh, they're just evil. But again, there's this sort of generosity and sort of understanding perhaps why there was a real need for self-preservation. But also within this kind of public versus private persona of the kind of the tragedy of sort of day-to-day life, and then this extravagant, almost like casual folle kind of unveiling in public. But both felt like they were that there was a deep flaw being hidden by what they were doing. So I thought it was really cleverly done, really beautiful, and I really urge you to check it out. The audiobook, which is how I read this book, I thought was also really well done in terms of the voices, in kind of capturing that sort of theatricality of it all. Yeah, I was really, really impressed and really blown away by this book, and thought it was really beautiful. Next up was What Girls Do in the Dark by Rosie Garland. And this, I thought, again, was really clever. This is a collection of poetry, and this brought together ideas around gender and sexuality and sort of juxtaposed them with science, and sort of used sort of astrophysics and sort of the interest in the wider world and the sort of world out, you know, the universe, and kind of played off that with sort of some of the images and some of the ideas of kind of the idea of studying a lover or trying to understand this sort of vast expanse that exists beyond you in terms of the lover. And I just thought it was really beautifully done. It didn't always work for me as a collection. I think most of the poems I found really beautiful and really worked for me. And they also worked very well reading them out loud, which is how I tried to kind of read this collection, because I'm finding that is how I engage with poetry best, when I can kind of hear it a little bit more. And I just thought, yeah, it was really well handled, and a really great section of poems. Again, it's sort of a strange comparison, putting poems against some of the other parts, but I think actually it's really interesting to have those discussions. You know, what does this poetry collection say about the LGBTQ plus experience that maybe can't be captured in another form of writing? And yeah, I thought this was really interesting. And again, this kind of exploration is of the kind of, there's this big wonder of the universe, and therefore it almost feels trivial to think about various parts of gender and sexuality and whatever in a kind of mean-spirited way, because there's this whole cosmos over here, and that's far more interesting. So just, you know, sort of let people live. You know, I thought this was really fun and a really interesting collection. Some really poignant and sad moments too, as well, that were lovely. And last but not least, The Ministry of Guidance by Golnoosh Nour. And this is a collection of short stories, which again is another fun comparison to put alongside everything else. And I was really quite impressed by this. I thought it was really interesting. Again, not all of the short stories worked for me. And I think the difficult thing at times for me was switching, because some of the short stories were written from the perspective of men, some from women, I believe, if I was reading it right. And so sometimes it can be quite jarring, where midway through you think you're reading from the perspective of a woman, but realise that you maybe missed some cues early on or something, which again, you know, is kind of fun, kind of very queer in itself. But this particularly looks at the experience of these characters in Iran, and the Ministry of Guidance is a sort of nod to a kind of government department. And what was really interesting and fun was how it, again, kind of gave this sort of real warmth and depth to these characters who are facing, you know, real sort of oppression and difficulty in navigating their identities in Iran. And, you know, for example, there is a short story where there's this kind of relationship between a student and teacher, and, you know, it's almost the student teacher part isn't the problem, it's the fact that they're both women, and that's the part that kind of triggers sort of a lot of complaints, and it basically almost makes this woman lose her job. It sort of really impacts the student, and there's a real discussion about the way that certain people can and can't in society articulate who they are and think about their identities. So I thought this was a really fun and clever collection. So really beautiful, humane moments of sort of these characters in these very loving relationships. And I think what this book does really well is I think, again, it would be really easy to frame the whole thing as being under the watchful glare of the Ministry of Guidance, and, you know, only speaking about the kind of oppressive elements of this. And I think this short story collection sort of sidesteps that really cleverly by talking about the characters themselves. And yes, this sort of, the oppression of the government is kind of an overarching thing that impacts these characters' daily lives, but actually it's not the whole story. And to frame it in that way would just kind of create these characters as people to pity. And I think, what's really clever about what Golnoosh Nour does here is bring out this kind of the warmth and the humour of what people do, you know, how people survive, the kind of agency of them to survive the system, as opposed to the horrors of the system itself necessarily. So yeah, I thought, again, it did some really good things. And again, it was a book I had not heard of at all until this prize. So really grateful that this collection of short stories has sort of been kind of given a bit more attention because of this. And that brings us to the end of this shortlist. And it's a really interesting one, I think, in terms of winners, you know, and sort of personal favourites. As much as I really enjoyed Dragman and kind of found it deeply charming, it's probably the book of these six that I probably enjoyed the most as an experience. But I think No Modernism Without Lesbians is such a good winner because it is just such an achievement. It is sort of uncovering these four women from history, giving them a voice and giving many other women and many other characters and people a voice who have sort of been left out of the way we talk about certain bits of history. And in her winning speech, I say winning speech, like she won for the speech, you know what I mean. In her speech after she won, Diana Souhami said that she really hopes that a book like hers is the kind of thing that might then encourage other people in future to become kind of queer archivists and historians and sort of sociologists and kind of carry on telling these stories and uncovering these stories. And I think that, pardon me, that is a real joy of this book, and I think a real beauty to it. So I think it's a very, very, very worthy winner, and a book that I just found incredibly captivating and really interesting, particularly how she's managed to synthesize all of this information in such a breezy, interesting way. And so that is the second of the two Polari Prize shortlists. I hope you've enjoyed listening to me babble on about them. I'd really love to hear your thoughts if you've had a chance to read any of them, or if there are any that you're really looking to read. And it's exciting to think about what comes next. What is the next Polari Prize shortlist going to look like? I'm sort of already trying to think of books that have been sort of released this year that would sort of be eligible for next year that could be really interesting. I'm thinking things like 100 Boyfriends by Brontes Pennell, and Tell Me I'm Worthless by Alison Rumfitt, both by Cypher Press, both of which books that I need to check out and really, really want to. I also just wonder what other books we're going to see crop up and be part of this, because I think it's just incredibly exciting that there are so many interesting LGBTQ plus voices in literature, and particularly being pushed even further and further to the fore. And I'm really glad to see it, and to see such a diverse range of those voices as well. So I've been Bob the Booker here. That's me babbling about books. Who would have thought? From Annie, who is very much asleep, just like really surprisingly. Annie, normally the second I speak in the house, even if I'm just in a work meeting, will just sort of crop up and want to hang out. But no, she's very chilled. Apparently the Polari Prize is the thing that calms her and soothes her. So there we go. I've been Bob. Take care and speak to you all soon. Bye bye.